All right, we're actually in Perek Lamed Vav, and I will put the screen on the Perek shortly. But just to recap a little bit, because for a couple of weeks we didn't during the summer we didn't learn anything. The Parsha is Parshas Pinchas, and it's the in of Rosh Chodesh that is spoken about in Parshas Pinchas. V'rosh chodshechem takrivu oila l'Hashem, it says. So the question that the Rebbe Rashab asks is, why does it say Rosh Chodshechem? Rosh is l'chora only one Rosh Chodesh. What's the Rosh of the Chodesh? The Rosh of the Chodesh is, in Ruchnistic terms, it's the Inyan of Zoh, whereas the Chodesh, the moon, is Malchus, so it's the sun and the moon. In other words, Rosh Chodesh is when the light of the sun first hits the moon. So what's the Rosh Chodoshim? So the Zohar explains that the Rosh Chodoshim are Yaakov and Yosef. Yaakov bechinas Tiferes and Yosef bechinas Yosoid. So the Rebbe Rashab, but Tmiya Gedoyla says, what does that help us? Like, what is that? How does that answer the question? So, in order to be able to understand that, we first have to understand the inyonim of the oros of Atzilus. The spheres of Atzilus are the Or Ein Sof bechinas Islapshus. When the Or Ein Sof comes into Islapshus Pnimi, in other words, Or is keilim, those are the spheres of Atzilus. And in the spheres of Atzilus, you have the in maaleh matah. In the Or Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, or the Or Ein Sof before Olam Atzilus. He's just speaking about it in a general way over here. But certainly in the Or Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, there was no inyan of maaleh matah. But when the Or becomes mislabish, when it's melubash, Or is in keilim, then you have the inyan of maaleh matah. Okay. And he, of course, he goes on to explain what the inyonim, some examples of the inyan of maaleh matah. For instance, chokhmah and bina. Chokhmah is the inyan of maaleh, whereas bina is the inyan of matah. Why is chokhmah maaleh? Because chokhmah is since it's the inyan of ayin, ayin to matzah, therefore it has more the inyan of oir than it has kli, and since the kli is the inyan of helem, therefore it's more the inyan of oir. It's more the inyan of it has a higher inyan in oir. Therefore it's the inyan of maaleh. Masha'en bina is the inyan of yesh, as opposed to the ayin of chokhmah. And why is bina yesh? Because it has keilim rechavim. The inyan of keilim rechavim, after there's a maaleh, that there's a maaleh in keilim rechavim. Nevertheless, it means that there's still an inyan of tzimtzum and an inyan of helem, and that's why bina is in fact called the inyan of yesh. Adam. Okay, so that is basically Perek Lamed Dalet. That Perek Lamed that we start off with the beginning of the Maimon, and then Perek Lamed Dalet was the inyan of chokhmah. Chokhmah is riboy or and mute keilim, whereas bina is mute ha'oer v'riboy and his rachvus ha'keilim. We then went on to describe not only in terms of chokhmah and bina, but in terms of the mediates and so on and so forth. And the mediates are even on a lower madrega, the whole inyan of Medidah v'hagbola. The more Medidah v'hagbola there is, the more helem there is in the spheres, and therefore you get the inyan of maaleh matah in the spheres. Maaleh is more oir and less keilim, and matah is more keilim and less oir. That's basically the word. It's not only in the spheroids, but also Perek Lamed Hey. It's also in the inyan of oilemis that you have the three oilemis of biyah, and whereas bria oilam bria is the inyan of bria yesh mi ayin, it still has some of the ayin in it of olam ha'atzilus. And therefore, it's on a higher madrega than the oilemis of Yetzira and Asiya, because Yetzira is obviously much more mugbal, it's more the inyan of keilim, and Asiya how much more so. And he compares that to the inyan of the human body, where you have a roish, a guf, and a regel. We know that the roish obviously is the most giloi or in the human being is in the roish. Then there's the guf, which has the inyan of midos, and the midos already losh and medidah, and so on and so forth. And the regel is ispashtus lachutz. And that's the whole of the Medidah of the oros and keilim and so on. The further they get down, and so on. Now, we will begin now. Perek Lamed Vav. Perek Lamed Vav. Okay. So, Perek Lamed Vav is as follows. He's going to speak more about this inyan of oros and keilim and the medidah and the keilim, but there's going to be somewhat of an interesting, we wouldn't call it a digression, but a chakira into the inyonim of what is in fact a higher inyan. Is the kli a higher inyan than the or is the or a higher inyan than the kli? And we'll explain why there's two start into this and what they're all about. In any event, Perek Lamed Vav. Omnam be'emes ein ze rak mitzad keilim. It's not only that there's maaleh and matah in the keilim, as we already explained. It's the keilim that make the maaleh and matah. The smaller and the fewer the keilim, that's the inner maaleh. Masha'in kan the hizrach was like keilim. That's the inner matah. The Hizrachvus and the Ribu HaKeilim, that's in the matah, but you have the same in the or as well. Omnam be'emes ein ze rak mitzad keilim, kim sheyesh medidah b'ha'or. Be'eze oifen hu nimshach lo ha'ir b'chol sfira chulu. There's the inyan of the or, how it's nimshach to illuminate that particular kli or any particular kli, one of the keilim or all of the keilim of the spheroids. There is a medidah in the or as well. Now, this in the medidah in the or as well, as we explained in previous shiurim, is not a shita which you find in the Ramak. As far as the Ramak was concerned, the or was the bechinas pshitus even when it's in the keilim, and therefore he gave the marshal of different colored keilim with water from the river in the keilim. When the water is in a blue kli, it's going to look blue, and a red kli is going to look red, and so on and so forth. But if you pour the water out, it's all the same water. All the same water. In all of the keilim, it's all the same water. The oil, as far as the Ramak is concerned, is all the same oil. And in fact, the Ramak did not really speak so much about the inyan of oil in keilim. He spoke more about the inyan of shefa, right? The inyan of shefa, or atzmus, he called it. Yeah, atzmus and keilim. And it's funny, because he called it atzmus, that inyan of atzmus, obviously, you want to describe it as atzmus being the same everywhere. But as far as the Arizal is concerned, there is an inyan of medidah and hakbola in the oil even before the tzimtzum. And that was a big chidush in the Arizal. And it's a chidush that is picked up in Chassidus. Chassidus brings both shittas. There's an inyan of pshitus oiros, and there's an inyan of hakbolas oiros even before the tzimtzum. And it's just, there are different madrigas. There's an inyan of pshitus the oiros before the tzimtzum. In the or that is etzema, called etzema or masha einkain. In the lower madrigas of or, the or shebegilu la'atzmo and the or hashayach lo'olamis, which is still before the tzimtzum. The tzimtzum is only in the or hashayach lo'olamis. But even in the madriga of or shebegilu la'atzmoi, there's also an inyan. There's not a medidah but poil, but there's an inyan of hagbola in the oil, and he's going to explain this inyan as well. We did explain it before, but he's going to extend that explanation out. Okay, so he says like this: V'gam ha-medidah b'ha-keilim, even in the medidah in the keilim itself, ba'eza oifen yiyu, in what oifen the keilim are going to be, hu kfi medidas ha'or is according to the medidah of the oil. What he's saying is as follows. Let's give let me just translate it first. The hagbola that there is in the keilim depends on what the nature of the oil is. He's saying like this. I'll give it b'derech moshel. Let's say a neshama is ready to come down it's ready to be born, ready to come down to earth. For whatever reason, it has to come down, whether it's because of a gilgul or whether it's because it's here to bring a new giloi, whatever it may happen to be. What kind of goof is that neshama going to go into? Well, no one would ever say that the goof determines the neshama. which guf it is going to determine which neshama comes into it. It's exactly adarabba. The neshama is lamaila, and because the tafkid that the neshama has to have a guf that's matim, that's appropriate and will work for the inyan that the neshama has to do. Therefore, the guf is according to the neshama. So the same thing over here in the inyan of the spheroids. The kli is according to the or, not the or is according to the kli. The way the Ramak explained it, the or is according to the kli, because when the or is in the kli, therefore the or itself, the water in the kli, in his marshal, looks blue, or it looks red, or it looks green, or yellow, whatever, depending on what the kli is. So in other words, it's the kli that sort of determines the color of the oil, the color of the water in the kli. But the way the Rebbe Rashab is saying it, yes, it's exactly the other way around. The whole tachlis is that the or should be begiloi, and therefore the kli has to be matim to the giloi that's necessary for the or. It doesn't work the other way around. Yes, it does work in certain cases. For example, in the inyan of gilgal and neshama betocha behema. When there's a reincarnation of a soul, of a neshama into an animal, that is definitely hagbola, and that's actually it's a punishment. It's an oynish for that particular neshama, for whatever that person did in his life. But that's a kli that's not matim for a human neshama. It's a vessel that's not appropriate. But b'derech klal doesn't work like that. That's only in very unusual and special circumstances. Masha'en kain, as far as the spheres are concerned, and here we're talking essentially about the spheres of Atzilus, the sphere is the kli of the sphere is according to the oil, and not the other way around. Okay, so he says it even more explicitly now. V'hainu shelefi medidah hamedidah ba'eza oifen yeh b'chinas hachokma nimdedah kli hachokma ba'oifen kach. In other words, the kli of chokma is according to what the purpose of that giloi of chokma is supposed to accomplish. The same applies to the other spheres. In order for the inyan of chokma to do what it needs to do, it has to have the appropriate kli, and therefore the kli is matim to the oir. Just as the guf is matim to this particular neshama that has to come down and do whatever it is that it needs to do in the world. Okay, he's going to develop this inyan somewhat more at length. The concept is as follows: as we explained before in Perek. What do we explain in Perek? This concept here, Demis Abus Haor Naase Hakli. The kli comes about from the thickening. His abus from Loshan Av, Ayin Beis. Av means thickness. The thickening, the congealing, the ore congeals, and that becomes a kli. Now, what does he explain over there in Perek? He doesn't just say that that's the shorish of the keilim is congealed oil. He doesn't say that. In fact, what he explains over there is that there's actually two separate inyanim. There's the inyan of the kav, which is the oir, and then there's the inyan of the reshimo, which is the shorish kli. The kav shorish or hamulubash, and the reshimo is the shorish of the keilim in which the oir is hamulubashim. However, what's the inyan of his abu sa'or? The or of the kav is meir. It illuminates the oisius of the reshimo. The reshimo is an inyan of oisius. There's the reshimo is called the Rala Sha'arim, the 231 gates of which are the shorish of the keilim. These inyonim, the reshimo is what was left after the tzimtzum. Now, the explanation, I don't want to go into it great arichus over here, but basically this is an inyan that is explained primarily in the sefer called Emek HaMelech, which was actually accepted by our Rebbeim. There's somewhat of a machloikes about the Emek HaMelech. The machloikas, whether it's accepted or not by the Sfarim, I think they don't actually accept him. His name was Bachrach, I forget his first name now. Occupied the Ayin Beis. And the Ayin Beis explained basically that what happens is that there's a Medidah in the oir. There's a Medidah in the oir before the Tzimtzum. Where's that Medidah? In the Or HaShaykh Lo'olamus. That's where it is, right? Then, when the Tzimtzum comes and the oir is nistalik, what's left is the Medidah, right? That measurement, that limitation of the oir, that's called the Rishimo. And it's called the Rishimo because it's what's left after the Tzimtzum. The Stalkus HaOr, only the Medidah is left. And that Medidah is called the oisius of the Rishimo. Now, why there 231? Because he explains that there's it's 22 times 21. Yeah, 22 times 21 divided by 2. I'll explain why. Let me just actually make a whiteboard for a minute so I can do this more clearly. I might have done it, explained it to you before, but anyway, it's 22 times 21 to 20 divided by 2. Why does it work that way? So what's 22 times 21? That's 462. 462 divided by 2 equals 231. That's where we get the Ralah Sharim from. But now, why 23 times 21? Because in the Ralah Sharim, you don't have oisius kfulois. You don't have oisius. In other words, you don't have aleph in the Ralah Sharim. It's only aleph Beis aleph, aleph gimel aleph, aleph daled aleph. But you don't have daled, you don't have gimel, you don't have Beis, and so on and so forth. There was 22 times 21. In order to get the smallest, or the how do you call it, the smallest number of sharim. What's a shar? A shar, a gateway, can allow things to come through it this way, let's say, right? From front to back, or it can go the other way, it can come from back to front, right? Now, as far as we are concerned, whether it goes from front to back or back to front is really doesn't matter to us right now. Just that you have 2 doorposts, right? The letter, let's call it the letter Aleph. Oops, the letter Aleph. Sorry, writing with a mouse is not my forte. The letter Aleph and the letter Beis, right? And then you have the letter Beis, and the letter Aleph would similarly be the same thing. That's why you just divide it by 2. It's just these are the same doorposts, right? That's why you would divide it by 2 to get 231 unique combinations. 231 unique combinations. So those are called the Ralah Sharim. And what are the Ralah Sharim again? The Ralah Sharim are the Medidah of the oir before the Tzimtzum. And then the Tzimtzum removes the oil from the Medidah. The Medidah is left. That's the Ralah Sharim. But in order for the Ralah Sharim to become actual keilim, they have to be illuminated by the kav. So the kav comes into the Rishimo, lights up the combinations of letters of the Rishimo, these 231 combinations, and that's what becomes the kli. It's the Rishimo that's actually the kli, but the or of the kav brings them into poil, and it actually, it brings them into poil. So that's what he just said. Oops, sorry. That's what he just said in the text. The Abus Haor Na'asa Kli. The Abus Haor is how the kav becomes misabe. It thickens when it comes into the oasis of the Rishimo. That even though the keilim have a different root, they have a different shoresh than the oros themselves. As I said before, the keilim Their shorish is the Rishimo Mashenka, and the oir is their shorish is the kav. Mikoma koma is how is bepoil the keilim who al deim tois oir. Nevertheless, the keilim bepoil that comes about through the oir, as I just explained. Therefore, va'al kain nishava hakli fi oifen ha'oir. The kli is according to the oir. In other words, the oir that's going to light up Aleph Beis, the letters Aleph Beis of the Rishimo, is going to be a different oir from the oir that's going to light up Beis Gimel. The keilim are lefi the oir. The keilim want to be revealed by the oir, so they pick out, so to speak, that inyan in the oir that's shaykh to them. Or maybe that's not quite the way to put it. It's more that the oir picks out the keilim that are proper for that particular oir. That's the way to say it. Again, Malkan is hama akli kafi oifen haor hanu shetiye muchan muchenes or muchana lekabel as oir. Those keilim that'll be muchan, they'll be ready and prepared to receive the oir. The Medidah huba oir, but the main Medidah is not in the keilim. In fact, the main Medidah is in the oir. Is oifen yoyim oilemus, because the whole tachlis of the oir is to the hoyrus oilemus. And therefore, it's the oir that decides what needs to be done. It's not the kli that decides, well, I'm gonna let this oir illuminate. I'm gonna let them. No, it's the oir that chooses the keilim that it needs in order to be mayor in the oilemus. Okay. Now this leads to a whole discussion, and in fact, it's an argument, a disagreement perhaps that has a resolution. In fact, the resolution is explaining about Chassidus, the Elu Ba'elu Dibur Kim Chaim, and we'll see. So the question is, therefore, what is the most important thing? Is the tachlis the oir, or is the tachlis the kli? Is the higher inyan the oir, or is the higher inyan the kli? Since the inyan of the kli was already, in other words, the Medidah of the oir was already there before the or hakav illuminated it. Therefore, it would seem that the shorish keilim is higher than the shorish oir. Masha ein kain. If you look at it from the mitzad the oir wants to be mizgal, therefore it chooses its kli. Therefore, you would say that the oir takes precedence over the kli. He's going to explain this in you now in the brackets. In the original shorish, medidas keilim kadum medidas oir. It comes before the keilim come before the oir, and we could explain this. Afilu al be said hapsukim in the creation of Adam. It says that the goof of Adam was first made, and then afterwards vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim. In other words, the chayus, the oir, only came later. But the goof was already made. You see, kapap shalakodesh baruch hu, the goof of Adam was already made, and then the oil was breathed into it. Okay, so you could look at it that way. The tachlis hakavona, who besides a keilim, you could look at it from the point of view that the ultimate kavona is not that the oil should remain lamaila without any way of it being misgale, even though it's the oil that chooses the kli. But the ikka is the kli, that the oil should be meir down lamata in keilim, which is in a sense it's quite a revolutionary way of looking at it. To put it in more simple language, what's the ikka inyan? Is the ikka inyan giluim, or is the ikka inyan nitava kodesh baruch hu liyos loy dirba tachtoinim? And the inyan of dirba tachtoinim, that's Isavus keilim, right? The dirba tachtoinim comes about through Isavus keilim, and that's the way it's seen in certainly seen in Chabad Chassidus that way, in Tanya and in many other places. So this is the whole argument: does the chomer come before the Torah? Does the Torah come before the chomer? We just said before that the oir chooses its kli. The oir comes before the kli, but that's already after the timtum. Before the timtum, the kli actually comes before the oir, and he's going to explain this further. Binyan hachomer koidem kadrum b'shorish hatzura. The binyan of chomer, in other words, the making of the oasis of the Rishimo before they're actually a Rishimo, but they're just the Medidah of the oir. In the oir lifnei hatzimtzum, that precedes the Torah being the or hakav as its mayor in the oasis of Rishimo. Okay, he explains weiter. The keilim up above actually mamshich the oil. In other words, P that we said that the kav chooses which keilim it's supposed to go into according to its tachlis. Nevertheless, the keilim is standing there, so to speak, waiting to be mamshich this or lamata. He'll explain a little bit weiter. We're not talking about the way it is keilim lamata because that's a whole different ball game. Keilim lamata sherak makablim hadavar. They only receive. They don't moishech the or. They don't attract the or towards it. It's if, so to speak, the keilim up above are kind of magnetic towards the or. They draw the or towards themselves. Why? Because the ikka inyan is the tachtonim. The ikka inyan is that the keilim should be nimshach lamata. Therefore, they draw the or into mediates, into their mediates. Sherak makablim hadavar, but down below they're only makabel. I need a matoicha. But above, the keilim are mamshich l'or. Now, if anyone has any questions, of course, don't be shy. I'll put the chat on the other screen so I can see it. And if you need to ask any questions, write in the chat or even unmute yourself and ask. Okay. Like the ivorium, the limbs of the body. The limbs of the body, they draw the chayus into it. In other words, if the limb is lying there lifeless, for instance, when a person is asleep or in a coma, whatever it is, right, and then the person wakes up, so then they draw the possibility of the limb moving. Yes, it's alive, but it's not moving. There's no chayus in it, right? It draws the chayus into the limb. Because the keilim really come from before the oil. The reshimo comes before the kav. This is only after the zichuch of the kli that it draws the oil into it. That according to its zichuch, according to the way it's been refined and so on and so forth, then it's going to be mamshich the oil. But at the beginning of creation, it's from the or thickening that the kli is made. In other words, that's again the oasis of Rishima. The b'shorsham medidas keilim kadum lemedidas oros. The measuring out of the kli, in other words, the hagbola of the kli in machshava, in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's machshava, before this keilim bepoil, comes before the medidas oros. But that's only the medidas oros. We'll qualify this in a minute. The measuring out of the keilim kanun medidas oros, just like the goof was kanum el neshama, only after the goof was created by yipach ba'apav nishmas chayim. V'rak behis galus medidas or kadum. But when it comes to his galus, then the medidas or, in other words, in order for the or to be misgala, then the inyan of the medidah in the or, in other words, the or that chooses its particular kli, it's kadum from that point of view. Who inyan? There's the inyan the machshava aretz kadma. In other words, again, as we said before, dir b'tachtonim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted there to be the inyan of aretz, and therefore it was kadma. But behis havus shamayim kadmu. Hashamayim l'Hashem. But and that's why they kadmu in the inyan of behis havus. In other words, in the inyan of seder shtalshlus, the inyonim ruchnim come before the inyonim gashmim. But the tachlis is the inyonim gashmim. The tachlis is the aretz. Or to put it slightly differently, the tachlis is the inyan of malchus. Mashenko and all the other spheres are just the way to get to malchus, to feed malchus, to make sure that malchus is able to do everything that it needs to do. All right, so he's going to explain this in the loshen of Kabbalah, loshen Eitz Chaim, and Shara Akdomus, and so on and so forth. The whole purpose of the kav is to make maaleh matah. Why? Because before the kav there was no inyan of maaleh matah. In the oil itself, there's no inyan of maaleh matah. But when the kav is nimshach, the kav is attached to the orein sof. It's attached to what's called the igul hagadol. That's where the kav comes from. What's the igul hagadol? The igul hagadol is the oir, the orein sof that was nistalik alidei tzimtzum, and it's now in a state of makif around the halal. Right, the halal be'emtza. The halal is the place where the tzimtzum affects, where the tzimtzum has its effect. That's called the halal. It's not mamish halal, but it's called the halal. It's void. It's devoid of the madrega of or that there was there before. There are certain madregas of or that are there, but it's not just the or shaykh lo'elamis are not there. For all intents and purposes, that or is not there, and that's called the halal. What's the igul hagadol? The igul hagadol is the or that was removed from the halal and now surrounds the halal. It's in a state of makif ala halal. That's why it's called ha'igul hagadol, and that's where the kav is nimshach from the igul hagadol. Now, at the top of the kav, it's attached to. It comes out of the igul hagadol. It's attached to the igul hagadol, but the sofa kav, the end of the kav is not attached. It doesn't reattach to the igul hagadol. It goes into the halal, and it doesn't touch the igul hagadol on the other side, so to speak. Right? The igul hagadol is a sphere, not just a circle. Right? But it doesn't go all the way through. It only goes to the middle of the halal, and there it stops. Then it sort of peters out, so to speak, the kav. And so, therefore, where it's attached to the igul hagadol is called maaleh, and the sof of the kav is called matah. So now you have the inyan of maaleh matah in the spheroids. You have maaleh matah in the kav rather. The kav is the inyan of maaleh matah. Dima ya hamshocha shelo al kav, because if the hamshocha would have not been by way of this particular kav, lo haya maaleh matah ba'oilimus. There wouldn't have been the concept of maaleh matah. Why? Because all the oilimus would have been equidistant, so to speak, from the igul hagadol, and therefore they would have all been equal. There would have been no inyan of maaleh matah. The whole oilam hayabashva b'chol chelkav would be equal in every way. All the oilams would be equal in every way. There wouldn't be an inyan of oilam atzilus. There would be an inyan of oilam abriya. What happens, in fact, with the kav is that the kav is nimshach into the halal. It's choizim is agel, choizim is agel, choizim is agel. It's nimshach in circular, like a corkscrew kind of a fashion until it gets in the middle, and that creates the spheroids of soivev, the inyonim of soivev, and it's also nimshach yosher. That's igulim ve'yosher, right? That's the kav nimshach in both ways. It's misagel, that's the inyan of igulim, and nimshach ve'yosher, that's the inyan of the spheroids that are the or of the spheroids that are melubash in the spheroids. In any event, had there not been the inyan of the kav, everything would have been on an equal madrega as far as the or hamakif of the igul hagadol. You wouldn't have been able to see or distinguish one sphere from the other, as it says in Mavoi Sharim is one of the Sforim of the Arizal, very much similar to Eitz Chaim. Eitz Chaim is more complex, but there's Mavor Sharim, Sharak Domes. All of them deal basically with the same, more or less with the same subjects, at least in the beginning. And the whole purpose of the kav then is to make a maaleh, is to make maaleh matah. And that's why the kav is a line, right? A line has a beginning in the igul hagadol and has an end in the halal. And therefore you have maaleh matah. Since the kav in it at the top of the kav, it's davuk to the orein sof. It's actually davuk to the igul hagadol. He doesn't go into it now, but that's the inyan of orein sof. It's the inyan of the ora shaykh lo'olamis that was nistalik al der tzimtzum. Ubakatzeu atachtoin, and its bottom point. It's not davuk to the orein sof. It's nimshach into the halal, and it doesn't touch the orein sof. Therefore, the kav has a beginning and an end, has a head and a tail, so to speak. Maaleh matah, above and below, top and bottom. Like they say, yesh ba'olam spheres gam ken maaleh matah. And therefore, in the spheroids, you also have the inyan of maaleh matah. You have this hierarchy of higher, in other words, what has more oil, and matah, what has less oil. The makablim elyon shel hakav, those that receive from the higher madrega in the kav, shekarav yoisel or in sof, which is closer to or in sof, shukin is maaleh. That's the aspect of maaleh. In other words, the higher madrega, the upper. Maaleh sheboy, harhu b'chidas maaleh. That's so the spheroids that receive from the elyon shel hakav, from the top aspect of the kav, they b'chidas maaleh. V'chol mashem mizrachik v'katzayu ha'elyon, harhu b'chidas matah. And the further it's mizrachik, the more matah it becomes. So you have maaleh and matah. Maaleh is which is closer to that which is closer to the beginning of the kav, which is touching the or in soif, and then matah is somewhere down below in the halal. That's why the kav is called kav Medidah. What's kav Medidah? Kav Medidah, right? It's called the kav, by which makes Medidah. It makes measurements and so on. Kav Medidah actually means what they used to use in the old days. Instead of a tape measure, they would have what's called a kav Medidah, a measuring rod, right? A measuring rod. That's the kav Medidah. I'm not sure which ma'ameh that is. The makor adavu me'etz chaim and all. It's this whole in is in etz chaim. I'm not sure what he's talking about in that ma'amer, but in any event. And now we continue. Zeu shakav nikra kav Medidah liyosh al kav hu medidas ha'oros, because the kav measures out the oil to go into this particular kli or that particular kli. Vima hamshocha he me'elyon shel hakav. If the hamshocha comes from the upper aspect of the kav, partzuf ak, for example, if we're talking about the partzuf of Adam Kadmoin. Now, what's the inyan of the partzuf of Adam Kadmoin? We're talking about the inyan of the oilam of Adam Kadmoin. Yes, it's true. We're talking about the inyan of the oilam of Adam Kadmoin, but there's an additional inyan that the highest aspects of the spheroids are also arranged in partzufim. In other words, the highest inyan of the oilamis is Adam Kadmoin, which is the partzuf of Adam. In other words, reflecting the inyan of Adam down below. That's the highest level of creation in our world. And then you also have the inyan of Atik Yoimin, Arich Anpin, and so on. These are all the higher madregas that are called partzufim. What's a partzuf? A partzuf is a composite inyan that has a, let's not call it a human quality to it, but it has a tachlis. It's not just an inanimate kind of a thing. It has a certain chayus and a certain kedusha to it that would not be reflected in the inyan of if we just called it an oilam. Therefore, we call it partzuf of ak. And why is ak called? Why is it called kadosh, and why is it the inyan of partzuf? Because it's makabel from the highest aspect of the kav. Shubikir v'lorein sof baruch hu. V'olam es lamata shlamata mikam yak makabel mikin richuk. Okay, so therefore a lower world will be a world that receives from a lower madrega of the kav. And so too with all of the spheres. The higher the sphere, the closer it is to the elyon shel hakav. The lower the sphere, the further away, obviously. And this is what it says in Eitz Chaim. So in the Orient Sof is closer to Chochma me'ayin timotze, and therefore Chochma is a high madrega. Then Bina is b'chinas richuk. Chochma b'chinas ayin, Bina b'chinas yesh. V'hanish b'bina me'era Orient Sof k'mo shu b'gera hasoga. Ub'chochma me'era Orient Sof k'mo shu l'ma'ale b'gera hasoga adai. K'mo she's boyer, as we will see in later in Maimorim. There's a different channel to each sphere from the kav, right? Each sphere has its own channel, so to speak. And he says, "Si birez or etc." The paradise, b'shar archei hakinuyim, Archei HaKinuyim is, he goes through sort of an alphabetical list of many, perhaps most of the important inyonim in Kabbalah, and he gives a brief explanation of those inyonim. That's called Shar Archei HaKinuyim. Kinuyim means nicknames or names that were given. So, but part of the Shar Archei HaKinuyim, Oishin, Kasav, Shir Koima, he's talking about the Indian of Shir Koima. Shir Koima, in other words, the spiritual stature of any particular thing. So what's the Shir Koima? Shir Koima. What's the Shir Koima? Shana Shoma Hamisachedes B'toch Hasfirois Nikreis Shiur. The Neshama, in other words, the oil of the Spherois, the Neshama of the Spherois, Nikra Shiur, it's called Shir Koima. Why? Shiur because it gives the measure of the entire stature, Koima meaning stature, of that particular part of that particular sphere, because the whole inyan is that the or should be misgala. Therefore, the or gives the shear to the kli rather than the kli giving the shear to the or. Vi haomeres la sphera die. And so to speak, this neshama or this oyer would say to the sphere, okay, that's enough for you now, right? You have your inyan, this is your inyan, you're the sphere of Tiferes, you're the sphere of Yisoid, whatever it may happen to be, right? Whichever sphere you may happen to be, die. That's your portion, that's what you're all about. He also writes over there, Shar Atzmus keilim. Again, Atzmus is the inyan. What the Ramak calls Atzmus, the Arizal calls oros. So whenever you see Atzmus in the Ramak, it means the Indian of oros. V'chein kasav b'shar Atzmus v'keilim Perek Zayin. This is the purpose of the sphere. It's according to what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted. But the way it says in Eitz Chaim, the Eitz Chaim explains it in a deeper oifen. It's not just that what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants, but how it comes about. This is the Hamshachas HaKav. The Kav is nimshach in a certain way because that's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to be mayor this particular or. Right, and that's why it's called Hamshachas HaKav, Bebechinas Hakiru v'Harichuk Sheboy, etc., in order to illuminate this particular sphere with the riboy or the lesser or that it has, etc. V'nimtza, therefore it comes out the Medidah b'malu matah, that the measurement of above and below, upper and lower, hu b'ha'oyer, is actually in the oyer before it's in the kli. How that or is going to be nimshach into that particular sphere. Is it going to be nimshach into the sphere in a way of riboy, which would be, let's say, sphere chokma, or in a way of miut, which would be b'chinas bina, or one of the other spheres below chokma. And therefore it turns out, and then after the spheres, you have his chalkus. His chalkus malu matah, above and below, higher and lower, in the oros primarily, and therefore also in the keilim. Hein ba oros, hein ba keilim, whether in the oros or the keilim, both. But it starts in the oyer. Im she'amadilu hu ba oyer bo'efen kazeh nishabu akli. According to the oyer will be the kli, or she'amadilu hu ba akli bo'efen kazeh. Or according to the Medidah of the kli, the or will be nimshach. That's according to a different shita. But in any event, that's how I explained that the limb is moishech, the chayos of the neshama. But the way he wanted to explain it initially is that the Medidah is in the oyer, and the oyer chooses the kli. On lower madregas, you could say that the kli is mamshich the oyer. In any event, the be'emes shnehem emes. The b'tchilas ha'yizgalus ha'Medidah hu ba'oyer. The beginning of the revelation, the measurement, the measuring out is in the oyer itself and not in the kli. The oyer chooses the kli. In which way it's going to be yair, in which way it's going to illuminate the particular kli, and how the kli is going to megala that or. That's up to the oyer. Who is Hisabus keilim? That according to this particular need of the oyer will be the Hisabus kli. And depending then on the keilim down below, we're talking about on a much lower madrega already, the keilim in the oilmas atachtoinim, they will be mamshich the oil according to how much the keilim become refined, mezuchachim. And mezuchachim means refined and purified. All of this that we were just mentioning above is not shaykh in the oros makifim, only in the oros pnimim. In other words, in the oros there can be melubash and keilim. V'chol ze enu shaykh rak ba'oros pnimim shabayim v'chnitzis labshus b'keilim sheyesh bahem medidah ha-medidah v'chnitzis chalkus t'malu matachulu. Okay.
I have a question. So this sounds like it's almost a tosefes of oil. That goes according to Zichu HaKeilim. So like there is a Medidah to start with. It reminds in Pirkei Avos we said Shlosh Dvorim Olam Moimed, Shlosh Dvorim Olam Kain, right? Yeah, that's something like that.
Yeah.
So is it saying that? Is it a tosefes or how do they square? So
I think they square by. I think the answer is that the medidah in the oil is in the higher madregas. The medidah in keilim and the keilim and mamshich or that's in lower madregas, lower oilamas. But it starts off with the medidah in the oil, at least according to this shita. Don't forget, there's the Ramak shita, which is that there's no medidah in the oiris. There's no medidah in the oiris. But this seems to be the shita of the Arizal and the shita of the Emek HaMelech and the shita of various others. Naftali Bachrach, that was his name. Now I remember the Emek HaMelech, Naftali Bachrach. In any event, so it depends. When we're talking about on higher madregas, before the Tzimtzum and just post the Tzimtzum in Olam Ak and so on and so forth. Therefore, the oros are the medidas in the oros, and they so to speak choose the keilim. The keilim and mamshich the oil.
So would it be again to put it in simple words, like the concept of davening that there is a certain oil that's a portion for a person, and then he has to bring it lamata. If he doesn't do it, it's still there, but it doesn't come lamata.
Yeah. That would be the keilim mamshich or yeah. I think that's a good marshal. Yeah. All right. Now he's going to go back to the beginning of the Maimah where we discussed the whole inyan of Rosh Chodesh. Why does it say Rosh in the plural? There's only one inyan of Rosh Chodesh. And the Zohar went on to say that this is referring to Yaakov and Yosef, Tiferes and Yesoid. So now he explains the inyan. We can understand now it says Rosh in the plural Chodesh. How many heads are there? Is it not true that there's no head for the sea for the moon? Ela Shimsha. The sun is the moon's head, so to speak. In other words, the sun is what illuminates the moon, and there's only one sun, so therefore, how can you speak of two Roshim? Ela Roshei train, but there are, says the Zohar, two Roshim. Yes, there are indeed two Roshim, Yaakov and Yosef. Now, he's going to explain to us now that Rebbe Rashab what the inyan of Yaakov and Yosef has to do with what we're talking about over here. The concept is as follows: in Moira is also another. It's a sort of it's an encyclopedia of concepts in Kabbalah. Moira. Quite a fascinating cipher. In any event, it's one of these encyclopedias, so to speak. The Tfilis Musaf who brings Yesoid. Shabbat Besot Tosefes. What's the inyan of Musaf? It's the inyan of Yesoid, and the sphere of Yesoid has a shaykhs to the inyan of Tosefes. What's the inyan of Tosefes? That's why it's Musaf Dafka, because there's an additional koyach that you have in Yesoid that you really don't have in all of the other spheroids. Afal Pi. that Tiferes is the channel through which the upper spheroids are channeled, but nevertheless, it's not Tiferes itself that attaches to Malchus. And since Malchus is a Tachlis, therefore Yesoid, which does attach to Malchus, has a Tosefes Koyach to bring about that Yichud. This is what we're going to explain. So, the Tfilas Musa who bechinis Yesoid, Sheba Basot Tosefes, V'hu Inyan Yichud Yisrael Barochel. So Musaf is the Inyan of the Yichud of Yisrael, Yaakov, but Yaakov in his higher Madrega, because there's two Madregas in Yaakov. There's Yaakov and Yisrael. Lo Yikarei Oy Shimcha Yaakov El Yisrael. Right? So Yisrael is a higher Madrega than Yaakov, and that Inyan that in Kabbalah's Forum, the Inyan of Musaf and Shabbos, I'm sorry, not Musaf on Shabbos, Musaf on Rosh Chodesh is the Inyan of Yichud Yisrael Barochel. He's going to explain weiter. The Zeu I have read bein Shachris leMusaf, the difference between Shachris and Musaf. And what happens during Shachris? The Tfilah Shachris who Yichud Yaakov Barochel. Yaakov is the lower Madrega. That's Yud Akev, the lower Madrega of Yaakov. Kisarisa imulakim v'anashim v'tuchal. Vatuchal already, that's the Inyan of Yisrael. But Yaakov was engaged in the battle with Esau, and therefore it's a lower madrega. It's the struggle and the attempt to set things straight and so on. That's the Inyan of Yaakov. So the Yichud of Yaakov and Rochel is a lower madrega of Yesod and Malchus. Utfilas Musaf who Yichud Yisrael v'Rochel. Yaakov Loshen Bekia. Yaakov is not only from the Loshen Yud Akev, but it's from Loshen Bekia to break through. Yaakov is the breakthrough Inyan. This is a big Inyan today in modern coaching and things like that. They call it the breakthrough Inyan. You have to find your breakthrough Inyan. So Yaakov is the Inyan of Bekia. He breaks through. As we say in the Pasuk, Az Yavaka Kashachar Oirecha. Your light breaks through like the dawn. Right, like the dawn suddenly lights up the sky, so too as Yavaka Kashachar Oirecha, your oira, the oira of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, lights up like the dawn. She'ena raka ora levad. It's only ha'ora. When what happens at dawn is you see light in the sky, but you don't see the sun. The origin of the light you don't see. Only the totzah, the results, the ha'ora of the light. That's the Inyan of dawn as Yavaka Kashachar Oirech. Whereas Yisrael, Yehu Bechinas Atzmis. Yisrael is the Inyan of the sun itself, so to speak, the sunrise itself. V'shneim and Bechinas Chochma. Both of them Bechinas and the Bechin of Chochma. But what aspect of Chochma? Bechinas Yesod Abba. Yesod of Chochma. Yesod of the Paratuf of Chochma, which is called Abba. Like Yaakov begins oros HaChochma, only that Yaakov is a lower madrega. It's only the ha'ora of Chochma, it's not Chochma itself. Masha'en can Yisrael begins atzmis HaChochma, and Yisrael is the essence of the Chochma itself. Moshe Kass will look at the term Rizal. Apostle v'Yaakov Eidus b'Yaakov v'Torah Sam b'Yisrael. Eidus b'Yaakov. Eidus is only testimony, right? Testimony is not on the same madrega as Torah. Torah creates the Metzias. Eidus only testifies to the Metzias. Torah creates the Metzias. So there's a difference between Eidus, which is shaykh to Yaakov, and Torah, which is shaykh to Yisrael. Vayakom Eidus be Yaakov, and Torah Sam be Yisrael. Yaakov bechinas Eidus levad. V'lo etzem adavar. It's only a testimony to the thing. It testifies to the real thing, but it's only a testimony. Yisrael bechinas aspus adavar. Yisrael is the thing itself. It's also the same concept as engagement and marriage. Erusin v'nisuin. The erusin in nobles chochma shalamayla. That erusin when a couple are engaged, it's only the overflow of chochma, but it's not the essence of chochma. It's only the overflow, the noivlois. What flows down and what overflows the cup, so to speak. That's the noivlos chochma shalamayla, and that's the Indian of that's noivlos chochma shalamayla Torah. In other words, even though it's the inyan of Torah, but it's still noivlois. It's not the etzema inyan. When nisuin is amshocha atzmis, b'chinas atzmis hachochma. Who inyan chitzonis haTorah, pnimis haTorah. Chitzonis haTorah, which is the edus, which is the inyan of nigla of Torah, mash ein kain pnimius haTorah, which is the inner dimension of Torah. That's called nisuin rather than just erusin. Pnimis haTorah. That's the etzem inyan of chochma. The chitzonis haTorah, whom b'chinas chitzonis hachochma, chitzonis hachochma. The b'chol zois harizeh ha'or levad lo etzem mamish. Even though it's a ha'or of Torah, but it's only a ha'or. It's not the etzem of Torah. Pnimis haTorah, he pnimis v'atzmas hachochma. Now, okay, now we discussed that Inyan already. Now he's getting back to the Inyan of the yichud of the light of the sun and the moon. When they come together and the new moon suddenly appears. The new moon appears when the light of the sun starts to once again illuminate the moon after not illuminating the moon for a short period of time. Okay, but where does this happen? It only happens in the or pnimi. It doesn't happen in the or makif. This whole yin of yichudim can only happen in the or pnimi, which is an interesting thing because yichudim is particularly an inyan that is spoken about in the Arizal much more than anywhere else. The Ramak speaks about kavonas. The Arizal also speaks about kavonas. The Arizal adds the inyan of zivugim and yichudim much more than the Ramak. The Ramak mentions them, but he doesn't make it. It's not such a big deal for him. But the Arizal makes, I don't want to use the word makes a big deal about it, but he puts a great emphasis on it. Let's put it that way. When it comes to the inyan of Chassidus, Chassidus is much more it's not the inyan of kavonas. It's not the inyan of zivugim and yichudim. It's the inyan of, it's called hashroa, which is like basically inspiration. It's the inyan of neshamas, rather than the inyan of technicality, techniques. It's not techniques, it's the inyan of neshama. And we'll discuss that another time. It's not for now, but it's a whole for bringing. Since there's an inyan of chalkus madregas, therefore you can have the inyan yichudim in order to bring them back together, to unify the madregas. Train, and therefore we mentioned two inyanim in Roshei Chodshechem, Yaakov and Yosef. The Pirush of Mikdash Melech. Mikdash Melech is a Pirush on Zoyar. Shezehu Tiferes v'Yesod. The Mikdash Melech explains Tiferes and Yesod are the two Roshim, Yaakov and Yosef. V'hainu the Yaakov Amshochas Ha'ora Kanal. Yaakov brings down the Ha'ora. Masha Enkain Yosef Ushayich to the Inyan Musaf, which is the Inyan. Yosef's the Inyan is Tiferes Yesod. That's why his Nisayan was with the Inyan on the side with Eishes Paroi. She wanted to entice him. That was his test, was the Inyan of Yesod. Omnam b'chinas Yosef hu ike b'chinas Yesod. Shu amshochas b'chinas pnius v'asus or insof. In other words, the Inyan of Musaf is a higher madrega of or than the or of Shachris. And that's what's called Musaf. It's moisif on what there was previously in Shachris. It's in the pnius v'asus or insof. Not just a ha'ora like Yaakov, as Yivaka Kashach Oirecho. This is the Inyan of the Etzem Ha'or. Zeu ben Porat Yosef, and that's why Yosef is called Ben Porat Yosef. What does that mean? Bra de Yizgi, the son who Porat means Loshem Pru Revu. He increases. Yosef bechinas Tosefes, or he's an Inyan of Tosefes. He adds and increases. It's always in a state of increasing with Yosef. Yosef is the Inyan of Lohosif, right? It's the Inyan of constantly growing, constantly adding, constantly bringing more and more gilun. There's a machmai mechazal that the tosefet of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is more than the ikar. In other words, the ikar that he gives you, or whatever, the ikar that he gave us originally, the tosefet is more than what was given originally. The additions add up to more than what was given originally. Or that is called the riboy, the multiplication of the or the vastness or vast is the wrong word. Ribo or how do you say riboy? Multiplicity of the or or whatever. It's much or. There's a lot of or. Ribo or is gilu or atzmi. What's revealed then is a gilu or atzmi. That's the inyan of Yosef. Va'inyan hu the chol hashpoes. So what are we saying over here? That there's two inyanim. Yaakov started off the inyan of the yichud of Yaakov with Rachel. But that inyan is the ikar. It's the ikar, it's the shoirish. It's not the tosefis. The tosefis is more than the ikar. With Yosef's ability to be mashpia in Yonim, he was mashpia etzem more than Yaakov Avinu. That's why Yosef is called Yosef, because it's Loshen tosefis. It's even more. Va'inyan who he's going to explain. Va'inyan who the chol hashpoas hein alidei asoid. All the Yesoid. All Hashpoas come about through the sphere of Yesoid. In other words, the Hashpoas into Malchus come about through Yesoid. It's two levels. Hashpoa chitonius, Hashpoa pnimis. An outward Hashpoa, an outward effect, and then the pnimistic effect. In other words, the Iker. The Iker is Yosef, is Hashpoa pnimis. And Yosef is the Hashpoa in the much more internalized, the much more Pneumistic, what else can you call it? Much more pneumistic hashpah than Yaakov. Yaakov was there to build the Jewish people. Yosef brought a new inyan into the Yidden. He brought a new inyan by giving them special status, so to speak, instead of being second-class citizens in Egypt, and now they went to live b'meitah ba'aretz in Eretz Goshen, b'chulu b'chulu. He gave them an extra inyan. He lifted up their tadmit, how do you say tadmit, their profile, right, to a much higher madrega. And so it is in Ruchnias. That's only in Gashmis. Obviously in Ruchnias, even more so. Excuse me. That's the or pnimi, has malo matah, ribu umiut, but it doesn't happen in the or makif. There's no head for the moon other than the sun. That's all hashpah into malchus is from the madrega of shemesh, which is Zeir Anpin, the madrega of shemesh. That's bechinas or pnimi. But there's two inyonim in shemesh. There's shemesh which is tiferes, and the shemesh which is Yisoid. The shemesh which is Yaakov, the shemesh which is Yosef. Each of them has their inyan, but the inyan of Yosef ultimately is higher. Was there yeshnei mini yichudim kanal? These are the two types of yichud. The yichud of Yaakov with Rachel, and then the yichud of Yosef with Malchus. Was there in the plural? Every month, nimshachim shnei yichudim, both of these yichudim. Hey b'chinas Yaakov ve'Yosef. Yaakov b'chinas ha'ora lavad. Yaakov is only ha'ora. He's not the ikar. And that's hashpah chitonius. And Yosef b'chinas hashpah pnimis va'atzmis. Who inyan bra the Yizki, the son who causes things to grow, right? Yosef, in other words. Yosef shenimshach b'chinas or atzmi b'giloi b'chinas malchus. That Yosef brings about that not only will there be ha'ora from the shemesh, from the sun, from Zeir Anpin into Malchus, but the ikar inyan of Zeir Anpin is nimshach into Malchus, the gilu atzmi of Zeir Anpin. Okay, Kitzer, and this finishes the mimer. Be'emes ein zerak mitzal hakli ki im sheyesh medidah ba'or. There's not only medidah in the kli, there's also medidah in the or. Lefi oifen zehu medidah is hakli, and according to the medidah in the or is medidah is hakli. The mis abus nase hakli, because of the thickening of the light, so to speak, by the Kavan and Rishimo, as we explained. That's how the kli is made. But oifen shetikabel or in a way that the or can be accepted into the keilim. K'mo shekatz b'etz chaim b'mevor sharim. The kav oisem mamomata. The kav makes higher and lower. B'pardeish nishmas. It should be. It's the neshama that gives the stature of the rest of the koima, the rest of the person's stature. What gives the person his stature? His neshama, not his goof. You might argue that Hollywood is an exception, but we're not talking about Sitra. In any event. V'shnayim emes, the medidas are kli, u'lefi medidas are oir. That the kli is measured according to the oir. The oir is maaleh, hakli lazeh, is muta kli. Right, muta kli. That the inyan of oir, the maaleh of oir is when there's fewer keilim. Not when there's many keilim, because many keilim are maaleh master on the oir. The orange is maaleh hakli lazehu rak miut hakli. It's only a very small kli, so to speak. If you open zichuch hakli, but when the keilim becomes zuchachim, then the mamshich the oir down in even into the keilim on the lowest madregas mamsheches es haoir val pihanol is bar mashakasu b'roshei chodsheichim. Roshei in the plural. We'll understand why. Therefore, Roshei again, Tiferes and Malchus, Tiferes and Yesoid being mischaber with Malchus. That's the inyan of Yaakov and Yisrael, and also the inyan of Yaakov and Yosef. Okay, Shkai, we finished the Maimah. I just want to mention that next week there will not be a class because I will be on my way back from the Ukraine. I'm going to the Ukraine not some to Ukraine. I'm going to the Baal Shem Tov and hopefully first to the Middle Rebbe, then to the Baal Shem Tov. And Mr. will also visit Lev Yitzhak Bedichev and Zusha Mipoli, Magrim is rich, and so on and so forth. But if anyone wants to send a letter or a pun to the oil, please send it to my email. You can send it to Ravm, RAVM Miller @gmail.com. So there's two M's, RAVMM ILLER @gmail.com. And I will take your letter or your pun or whatever it is to the oil of Baal Shem Tov. And if you want me to take it elsewhere as well, to the Maggid or whatever, please mention. Okay. Shekayach, and Bez Hashem we'll continue after I get back.
Thank you very much.
Okay. All tov, Laila tov. I'll put this recording up shortly.